This is The Annex, an academic sociology podcast. I'm Joseph Cohen from Queens College in the City University of New York. Today, we're going to revisit what I think is one of the coolest corners of the discipline, neurosociology, which studies how the human brain interacts with social life to produce all of the phenomena that we like as sociologists. Our guests for today are Regan Firat from the Sociology Department at the University of California at Riverside, Michalska from the Psychology Department at UC Riverside, and Will Kalkhoff from Kent State University. An introduction to neurosociology coming up. So a few years back in 2019, I got to meet Regan Firat from the University of California at Riverside, Richard Carpiano, a great sociologist. You guys have such a strong department at UC Riverside. Anyhow, Richard Carpiano recommended her, and it was a fantastic interview. I liked it so much. We talked about how her research that used brain scans to probe the emotional states that are often bundled up with phenomena that we as sociologists like to study, like racism, ethnocentrism, and things like that. And I really loved hearing about the work. I walked away with an appreciation of how much more complicated and deeply ingrained things like racism are. It's a worldview that's bound up with visceral reactions and non-conscious behavior. And I walked away thinking, wow, taking a racism out of a racist seems tantamount like convincing an arachnophobe to start liking spiders or to get somebody to quit smoking. It's not just a question of clever arguments. Like, there's a lot more going on there that I had no cognizance of. And so it's one of my all-time favorite episodes. If you want to hear it, you can go on the website or hear it in the back catalog. It's from back in 2019. And today, Regan has been nice enough to sort of arrange a panel and bring in some other neuroscience scholars to talk about these types of topics. So first of all, Regan, thank you for coming back. It's great to see you again.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure. I'm thrilled. Thank you so much.
Very briefly, before we move on, can you just give us a sense of what you've been working on lately? Not the details, but the headlines.
Yeah, absolutely. So my research has been shifting towards health disparities. So I'm investigating ethno-racial disparities of mental health. Since the pandemic started, I've been very interested in how the pandemic has been affecting mental health, stress levels, anxiety, and depression. So I'm investigating that, and I'm also collaborating with Dr. Michalska here on studying ethno-racial socialization effects on children's conduct problems and brain development. So that's what I've been up to so far. Yeah, and excited to be here again. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's great. I loved your piece in context. I'm looking forward to talking about it. And we do have Regan's collaborator, I guess, from across the hall or wherever you guys are located, from the Psychology Department. Michalska is in the Sociology Department at UC Riverside. It's a pleasure to meet you. I just want to say up front, the first time I interviewed Regan, I faked that I understood the titles of her articles, and I clearly did not know what I was talking about. So I'm not going to introduce your publications because they're so far out of my league, but welcome, Kalina. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for having me. Thank you for the introduction. And thanks, Regan, for the brief introduction. So I am the director of the UCR KIND Lab, the Kids Interaction and Neurodevelopment Lab in the Psychology Department. And our lab is focused on the neurobiology of emotions, including empathy, fear, anxiety, and aggression. And my training is in developmental psychology. So as a developmental scientist, I'm principally interested in understanding how these systems develop in typically developing kids, but also kids at risk for psychopathology, including disruptive behavior and anxiety.
So cool. And then finally, Will Kalkhoff. He's a professor of sociology at Kent State, where he specializes in social psychology, group dynamics, and neurosociology. Again, I would be faking it if I pretended to understand what was being discussed in the title of your articles, but they're really great pieces, and I'm looking forward to talking more about them. Welcome, Will. Do you want to start by telling us a little bit about what you do, what you're working on now?
Yeah, along with my colleague Josh Pollock, I run the Electrophysiological Neuroscience Laboratory of Kent, the NLOC. And, we sort of by testing different social psychological theories using neurosociological methods. But recently we've been we're working with police training organizations to study how officers perform in critical incident types of situations, threatening situations. So basically the shift has turned from sort of typical conventional academic research to more applied types of stuff. Obviously a timely project.
Oh, yeah. We got to talk about that.
Mhm.
Well, first,
Sure.
let's orient ourselves towards the field first. So on the first day of your seminars, when the graduate students are wandering in, wondering, what's neurosociology? What am I studying? What are the payoffs? What do you tell them? What is neurosociology, and why is it valuable for aspiring sociologists or sociologists in general to study neuroscience? Why don't we start off with Regan? Because I saw your syllabus and it looked very good.
I'm teaching a neurosociology PhD seminar right now, and these are the questions we're dealing with. So last week we talked about this. What is neurosociology? Do we need it? What are we doing here? So obviously a lot of the students are super excited, very interested, and they're super awesome students because they come up with these really creative ideas, bridging neurosciences, psychology with sociology. So they're just like they're curious minds. And I'm fascinated with all my discussions with them. But of course, we don't have a clear conclusion on what neurosociology is. So last week we talked about this. And they asked me, why not just call it social neuroscience? Why do we say neurosociology? And so I gave them my position. So I'm going to tell it here. So sometimes we sociologists who do neurosociology, we argue that, well, we are focusing on the social structure, societal phenomena, and groups. That's why we call it like neurosociology. I told them that actually social neuroscientists also study these. It's not that they don't understand or they don't know these concepts. I told them that I am using the term neurosociology in a more motivated way to push the discipline in that direction so that they would embrace neurosciences and biological sciences. Because as you also know, there's a pushback to biological or evolutionary sciences from social sciences. That's why I told them that I use it intentionally so that I could open a trail in that direction and students can follow and other people can follow. So I told them it is not necessarily because we have like large ontological differences with neurosciences. I don't think we do, because neurosciences is interdisciplinary. Philosophers are neuroscientists, economists are neuroscientists, psychologists are neuroscientists. So the reason I'm using the term neurosociology is to make an impact within sociology and kind of bridge the fields. And also this way, sociologists can contribute to neurosciences. There are not a lot of people like Will and their lab is one of the few labs in the world probably. And there are very few people around the world, very few sociologists who do this type of research. So I think that's an intentional bridge that I'm trying to build. That's what I say. That's nice. What I literally said last week to my student.
How about you, Will? Does that sort of concord with what you tell students when they're walking in the door?
Yeah, I think that, the way I usually start is I'll ask them, when was the last time somebody did something and you assumed they did it for this reason and you turned out to be wrong? And it doesn't take them very long to give me an example of the last time that happened. And that's a fundamental problem in any social science. We study behavior, and the reasons why people engage in that behavior, or the reasons they tell us they engage in that behavior, or what they say about their behavior, or what they say they think, that's not always accurate. So, there's a validity problem there. And I think what really drew me to neuroscience is, we can start to look more deeply into the mechanisms behind behavior, the actual explanations for why people do what they do. And so that for me, it helps solve sort of a fundamental sociological problem, which is the difference between what people say they do, what they actually do, or what they say they think and what they actually think. I mean, it's kind of an overstatement, but the brain doesn't lie.
Yeah.
So that's what really got me interested in it.
So from the what do you guys see as the payoffs? Maybe I'll start with Kalina. From the outside looking at sociologists, what do you see as the big value added that neuroscience could do to bolster, these aspiring sociologists' career or put them on a path to better science or better theory? What are your thoughts on that? The value of it?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I think, in my own classes, I'm a developmental neuroscientist. So until I started collaborating with Regan, I didn't particularly phrase my questions in a sociological context, but really development and social behavior and social interactions are inherently social phenomena that are informed by sociology. And I think, what we can offer, and especially developmental neuroscience in particular, is that our neurobiology has shaped the cultures that we've created, right? So humans have created these complex social structures, these complex organizations, groups, and also cultures shape our own brain. So there's really like a bidirectional relationship. And I think understanding like what some of these biological principles are that help shape social structures can lead to an important dialogue. So I think that, when sociologists consider biological factors and biological principles about brain organization, they can learn about how these social structures emerge.
Any other views on the payoffs, Will or Regan? Payoffs when a young person is like, what's this going to do for me?
Yeah, it is. I mean, there are payoffs. And I tell my students that it is not the traditional sociological route. It is not the traditional path. I'm pretty open. I tell them it might be more difficult to publish. It might add to your training. It might add in terms of time and the coursework that you do. It might be difficult to present or find avenues to present, but I also tell them that the discipline has been moving and changing, and now there are more platforms, there are more venues to do this. And people are collaborating. There's a lot of interdisciplinary research, social sciences, psychological sciences. We have a lot of collaborations. So in that sense, it might also be helpful. But there are obviously payoffs and trade-offs. And we have witnessed it I have faced it in my career. It's a bumpy road. It's not always easy. Mm-hmm. But I tell them, if you're curious about it, is this something you like to do? Because what we research ultimately should give us, I think, joy, and we should enjoy it, and we should be passionate about it. So if it is something that they're passionate, I'm like, it's worth the bumpy road, just do it. And so far, it's a mixed bag. A lot of students are super passionate, but some students just want to be exposed, but not necessarily follow the path of a neurosociologist.
It's also like you can't do something new if it's well recognized. Like,
right.
I guess the safe path for that is if you want to just analyze GSS data, run regressions on GSS, like that's recognizable, but it's not really a path to, big innovation.
Yeah.
Will, what's your view on this sort of the payoff of neurosoc?
Well, the payoff kind of ties back to what, or at least in my mind, ties back to what I started out by saying. And, sociologists study things where it's very hard, for example, just to ask someone, so are you a racist or are you a sexist? There's very few people who maybe, if they are a racist, they're going to tell you that. Mm-hmm. I think there's a great Dostoevsky quote. I can't remember the quote exactly, but I'll have to more paraphrase it. It says, everybody has these things lurking around in their mind that they wouldn't tell, even to their friends, they'll keep to themselves. But then he says, but also within us, there's things that we don't even want to admit to ourselves. Yeah. So even for those who might not think, I'm a racist, but I'm not going to tell this person that, there are these biases within us that we don't even have a conscious awareness of ourselves. And these neurosociological methods allow us to probe that a little bit. So to give you an example, we're studying students' reactions of their student participants. We're studying their reactions to mugshots. And we're looking at an EEG signature that is basically a measure of social expectation. And what we're finding is that when people look at a picture of a black suspect in a jumpsuit, they aren't as put off by that, or they think, yeah, that's the way things are supposed to be. But when they see a white person in a jumpsuit, you see a spike in this EEG signature that measures this sort of expectancy violation.
Huh.
And so you get kind of a sense of how people think of, we're trying to tie this to, jury decision making.
Huh.
And that, you expect people in certain groups to be criminals, and you don't expect people in other groups to be criminals. And how does that factor into things like jury decision making and criminal sentencing? And this is not something you can ask someone,
Right.
Were you biased when you were on that jury? If most people are going to say no, and maybe they weren't, but maybe they were.
Yeah.
And so, using some of these techniques, we can really probe deeply into the conscious and unconscious caverns of the human brain, the human mind, to see what's going on in there, and to try to get a sense of where these biases are and how they occur in social context. So I think that's the value, studying things that are hard to study.
Yeah, really. I mean, I guess so you can get to the person who's like, says, well, I donate to the Democrats and I profess to believe all of these things, but you can still probe to the finding that will not surprise a lot of people, that those self-reported, race blind people have implicit reactions to race. And that plays out, I guess, across social life is what you're saying.
Sure. And we shouldn't, it's important that they do the things that they do too. They do all these wonderful things in society, and just because, there's some bias there, that doesn't make them a bad person. But what it does suggest, it can be something that a person can really use for self-reflection. So, let's say if we find out there's some kind of bias lurking in there, and I go back to the sort of jury context, are you going to pay attention to certain kind of evidence that are more consistent with this view that you might not even be aware that you have? So selective perception issues, confirmation biases. So there's all sorts of interesting things that come up. And I think social scientists could benefit from understanding how that influences their own teaching and research as well, because, we're not immune from it either.
Yeah, that's one of the things that really is interesting and struck me in my first exposure to neurosociology. It's like it at least has the promise that you can overcome some fundamental weaknesses in all of the methods that we've been relying on, like self-reports and observational research. Like you can really dig down, and it's quite interesting. I have to say, one thing that I enjoyed in my first exposure to Regan's work was I had part of my work is in culture, and I had a very ideational centric view of culture. Like I don't know if you follow like the sociology of culture literature, but it's very it's very focused on the ideational structures that people use to interpret the world, and it's easy to fall back on sort of an over mental or an over sort of conscious actor conception of how social groups work. And what really struck me about Regan was like, wow, so much of what we do is not conscious behavior. So much of what we observe and what manifests as group behavior isn't driven by deliberate decisions or, purpose of behavior, but rather like automatic behavior that wouldn't even come through if you asked a person to account for what they do, for explanations of why they behave as they do. Maybe it's interesting to drill down a little into sort of some of the concepts, some of those like pre-conscious concepts that your work taps into, and might be part of, if sociologists were to construct theories premised on action models, then maybe they can develop action models that are a little more concordant with what we know of how people think and how people behave and how people act. Maybe we'll just do a little walkthrough. I thought maybe we could start off with Regan's context piece, or at least the research that she alluded to in her recent context piece. Do you want to start us off, Regan?
Sure. I mean, actually, before that, I also want to remark that a lot of our thought processes are also emotional. So it's not just non-conscious or implicit, but it is also emotional. And the way we react, all our thought formation, behaviors, they are very emotional. Because I also study morality and culture, so I'm very familiar with sociology of culture, literature. So, I mean, we have a lot to learn from psychology and neurosciences because of the findings that they brought on emotions and like morality. We are, as sociologists, we shifted our attention to emotions literature and affect. And now we see how important it is, these affective processes. So in a way, so in the context piece, I am actually studying morality and how morality and values, how does that shift our schemas, our framing of the world around us, and especially within the pandemic context. How do people respond? So one of the topics I'm interested in is that do these moral values that sociologists define as abstract and mostly conscious constructs, do they moderate these processes? Like, do they help people cope with negative life stressors like discrimination or the negative effects of the pandemic? So that's what I tried to do in that piece. That's actually an illustration of some of my other empirical pieces, like larger projects. And what I'm trying to show is that even the processes with values, they are non-conscious and they are emotional.
Right.
So this is not something that is considered in sociology literature a lot. Like, so values and morality, traditionally, they have been thought to be more rational and conscious and cognitive processes. But what I'm saying is that no, they're not that rational. They're actually emotional. And they might help people cope with these difficult situations. And they might be important resources for marginalized people, for communities who are marginalized. And if we understand how they operate, then we can understand which ones would be more useful for different communities. And we can maybe help in that direction. We can support certain cultural coping mechanisms, coping styles. So that's what that's like not necessarily what I did in that context piece because it's very short, but this is part of my larger research agenda.
Can I just piggyback on something you said? I remember I spoke to Craig Rawlings a few weeks back on a different episode about cults and how people like shift their beliefs and can sometimes engage in self-harm. And what I walked away with was an impression of how pliant people's reasoning is, like how motivated and vulnerable to motivated reasoning are just our way of seeing the world is. It's really striking. And it sometimes makes you wonder if it even makes sense to rely on people's accounts of why they do what they do, like how valuable those things actually are.
Yes, very difficult to change people's minds. Like, you're not going to change people's minds by explaining them the pros and cons of something. There's a lot of literature in political psychology as well that show that what you say, what the politicians say, they do not matter. But if you just change the person who is saying that, then you can change the person's mind. And I just quoted this. I browsed online. I browsed Reddit a lot, so I found this like meme, and I just told it to my students. Like, if you want to change someone's mind, you don't need to like argue with them or anything. Just tell them that someone they think is stupid agrees with them, and then they're going to change their mind.
Yeah. So let's talk about agency and health outcomes. You were talking about agency in that piece. What is agency? That's an interesting sort of topic. Tell us about it. What is agency and how does it affect health outcomes?
Yeah, I focus on agency. I mean, there's a big sociological literature on agency, and it is rather debated, the concept of agency. What is it? Do we have this capacity for agency? I focus on it a little bit differently. So I think that agency is this motivation, I also focus on the value of agency that is structure. So I don't think that some people biologically have more agency than others. I think that all humans have the capacity for agency, which is being in charge or control of our environment, being able to manipulate our environment, and future foresight, future planning in tandem with our reflections on our own self. So we can guide our actions. And that's why I study certain values. I think they can motivate they might be important motivators for agentic capacities. So that's what I focus in terms of agency, agentic values. But I think all humans share this, and actually we share this with other primates and even with some monkeys to a certain capacity.
I interpret it, and please correct me with all of your stuff. I'm going to profess that I'm going to get everything wrong, and you should think of me as like a B- student. But what I gathered from you was that you were saying, I was inferring that the environment sort of conditions people to think that if they behave proactively, it will pan out for them. And there are other people who are somehow taught by the environment the lesson that no matter what you do, it's going to fail, or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. And your argument is that being conditioned in an environment to believe that your choices matter is a factor in whether or not people can protect themselves or seek help. That's the basic idea?
Yeah, because agency is such a fundamental, I think, human and also other primate construct that it is very crucial in our well-being. Like this capacity for well-being is very important for that. And I think the opportunity, so that's why I think we all have it, but the opportunity to enact it or the opportunity to evaluate or to motivate us in that direction is very structural. And it is tied to structural inequalities. So that's the position that I was taking. So these inequalities, so people have this capacity, but if people are oppressed, they can't act on this capacity. And then it's not helpful. So I think what I was trying to say is that we have to find structural opportunities that's going to help people to be able to act on these capacities. Because I think communities' own judgments of their own well-being is very important. And that's something we don't often take into account. Also, as sociologists, we're very top-down, very didactic, but we need to focus a little bit on the capacities of the communities, of these community members. And actually with Kalina, we have a research project where we're trying to do that. We're trying to bring community members' input in our research. We meet with them regularly. We ask them about our research, what they think. We get their input. We ask them, what is important for you? How can we help you? And they give us feedback. So, and I think that's very important. And having that agency, when like having the being able to contribute to our research is, I think, helping them. It's just the fact that they can do this, giving them this opportunity. So that was my position. I don't know if it's like a clear answer, but it's
what I liked about it is that it presents agency or agentic behavior as a variable that's like distributed across the population. I mean, there's a lot of theories that just assume people behave with agency or they're like structural dopes, but I've never thought of it as like a population characteristic or something that could be inculcated or discouraged. Mm-hmm. And I guess that's sort of the idea with neurosociology. You can get a sense of different action models that underpin our theories, and it sort of opens the door to thinking of different phenomena. Let's do another one. Okay, Kalina, I wanted to do one that I liked in your work. So Kalina does a lot of work on fear and reaction to harm. And I wanted to talk about your work on threat over generalization in children. This is an interesting psychological mechanism that's operant in a lot of phenomena that we study. Can you tell us what's threat? Well, first of all, what can you tell us about threat perception in general?
Sure.
And maybe overgeneralization in particular.
Yeah. So, I mean, threat perception is necessary for survival, right? Like it's evolutionarily adaptive. It exists across the spectrum. So rats, amoeba, I mean, all kinds of organisms respond to threat in their environment in order to survive. So they have to be able to distinguish between threat and safety, and humans have to distinguish between threat and safety. And threat can manifest in different forms, right? It can manifest in a bear, but it can also manifest in a police officer who is a threat to some people, but not to others. Threat to some people of color, not to others. And social threat, it could be an educator. So it could be an educator that treats a child differently because of their background, because of their race, because of their gender, all kinds of things. So there's immediate biologically relevant threat, but then social threat is just as much a threat. And so it's adaptive for organisms to be vigilant around different exemplars of threat and safety. You don't want to be casual around a police officer because that has deadly consequences if you're from a particular background. So you do want to be vigilant, but threat generalization is the mechanism by which threat responses, so freezing, running away, sometimes aggression even, they extend to a range of stimuli. So let's say you have an experience with a person who treats you badly or who presents a threat. And then you generalize to other individuals who maybe look like that person, who maybe have similar characteristics. And then it's no longer adaptive because maybe that was a good opportunity for you. Maybe that was a learning opportunity. Maybe that individual actually wanted to help you, but because your threat response now generalized to an individual who looked similar to the first one,
right?
So the generalization is basically learning mechanisms, and whereby the threat response extends to a range of stimuli. So it enables a rapid response, but at the same time, it can actually contribute to the emergence of anxiety. If you're wary of all people who look similar, you can then develop an anxiety disorder and avoid social situations that might be helpful.
So it's almost like what I'm gathering from what you're saying is that just as a person can develop fears about something, a class of things that are associated with a particular traumatic experience or maybe series of traumatic experiences, you're saying that like entire communities, if they feel like they've been subjected to threat, they can become fearful or develop phobias like to police. You can develop like a police phobia, basically, and it almost exists like a clinical level, like an arachnophobe is afraid of spiders.
Absolutely.
Is that what you're saying?
And yes, and you know, like before collaborating with Regan, I often thought I didn't think about it at the population level, but I thought about it in terms of an individual difference, a biologically based difference. But here, it's actually, you can't really call it psychopathology because it's an adaptive response to trauma, right? Like, it's actually quite adaptive. Very sadly, it's adaptive to have this generalized response because the cost is so much greater.
I have a question. So are there the ways that we treat these cases in the particular, like you run into a child who's afraid of, I don't know, all adults because they had a bad experience with an adult. Clinically, what would you do with that child? And are there analogs that could be implemented on a population level? Like, is there some type of key to breaking some of these problems, or is it too hard? Am I just reaching too much?
No, I think some of the most successful therapies are actually exposure therapies. So, you know, sometimes we see kids who are afraid of fruit. And then you might expose the child to a picture of a fruit, photograph of a fruit, a toy fruit, and then an actual fruit. And so exposure therapies in this context, it's tricky. And so Regan and I are working on some buffers that might provide kids with tools to sort of not internalize and not have chronic anxiety. But at the same time, as I mentioned, like some of these responses are actually adaptive because these things may in fact be harmful. And so totally letting down your defenses wouldn't be an adaptive strategy. So I think working on both of these things in parallel, dismantling these structures that are facilitating this kind of generalization is absolutely necessary. In the interim, giving children and adults as well, but children the tools to be prepared and to be, as the Regan says, active agents. I think we could do those things in parallel. And we know from the individual level that exposure is very beneficial, and the extent to which we want to implement exposure for these broader social values, I think, is something that sociologists can be really informative about.
I love this topic. I have like topic envy with you guys on some level. Like, I stopped biology in grade 11, so it's definitely not going to happen for me, but I just love hearing about it. Well, you wrote on status systems. It's sort of the system by which people come to defer to one another, like a social hierarchy. And you talked about expectation states. What's that? Tell us about it.
Well, there was the theory that we were looking at says, differences in social status produce differences in expectations of competence, which then produce differences in influence. So, for example, we expect someone who's highly educated to be more competent than someone who more generally competent than someone who has less education. So we would expect, the person with more education to be more influential. The problem with that theory is it's very difficult to measure the mediating construct expectations. We've always just assumed it.
Right.
We've tried to measure it, but they'll measure it at the end of the study, in which case they're creating a methodological problem. You're measuring the mediator after the outcome. And they've tried all sorts of ways to deal with it. So the whole point of that article was to try to measure this mediating construct, expectations of competence, using electroencephalography. And actually that same measure I was referring to earlier, this measure, this brain level measure of expectancy violation. And so that's what we were attempting to do. So we had, a participant who was manipulated to be either high status or low status relative to a partner. And then the partner was engaging in behaviors that were either inconsistent or consistent with their status assignment. So, you might think that you're high status and you have this low status partner that's going along with you. If you have a disagreement, they say, yeah, you're right. That's what we'd expect to happen. But you can have a low status partner who keeps disagreeing with a high status person, which is an expectancy violation. And you can it can be the other way around too. You can have someone who is high status who's continually changing their mind to go along with someone who is low status. So we can create these different consistent or inconsistent behaviors. And it was really cool to see how perfectly they lined up with this EEG measure of expectancy violation. I mean, the results couldn't have been more perfect. I mean, the greater the expectancy violation, the greater the EEG signature. It was really kind of fascinating. So I think we really found evidence of this mediating construct in this paper.
So just what's EEG? Can you just explain it in a really dumb way?
Yeah, it's electroencephalography, EEG. And so basically, you put on this thing that looks kind of like, in the most common application, you'll put on this thing that looks kind of like a swim cap. And it's got electrodes that are placed across the surface of this cap. And in our case, we inject a little bit of gel into each electrode to create a contact between the electrode and the scalp. And basically, these electrodes are directly measuring electrical activity in the brain at the neuronal level. So you can measure brain activity using electroencephalography. Now, it's not as good as methods like what Regan uses, fMRI, for determining where in the brain something is coming from, but it does have a number of common applications. You can do some analysis of localization, but it's not very well regarded. Normally what we do is what's called event-related potential analysis. It's very commonly used for that, and that's what we were using it for in the study that you read. And basically the idea is, past research has shown that certain kinds of cognitive activities, certain kinds of emotional reactions are associated with specific EEG signatures.
Right.
So, the knowledgeable sociologist would have this encyclopedia of different things that EEG measures, cognitive activity, expectancy violation, fear. And so we say, okay, we want to measure fear, so let's look at this particular measure. And then you just look at past research to see how they've done it, and you would replicate that. So that's basically what it's doing.
So just to make sure I understand, so it's like you have almost a hat or a helmet that measures the electrical activity of your brain.
Yes.
And over time, people have cataloged, and they're like, when you see this electrical activity, it means the person's doing this. When you see this, it means they're doing that, etc. And this research found that when high status or low status people break their rules, their expected rules, then it's like the part of the brain that lights up that says something is wrong here, or like something is wrong here is lighting up. In essence, I guess it's an expectation violation, but
yeah, it's not necessarily the part of the brain that we're looking at. That would be something Regan would do with functional magnetic resonance imaging. But there is this, we did what's called an event-related, an electrical signature that's very well known as a measure of the degree of expectancy violation. So, what more perfect measure to use if you want to study expectations and violations of expectations.
Does that distress people? Like violated expectations, is that a source of distress generally, or how do people react to that?
It's very interesting that you should bring that up because, yeah, it should generate some level of discomfort. And actually, we predicted that the greatest reaction would be seen among high-status people who have this low-status partner who keeps disagreeing with them, because in this particular study design, there was money on the line.
Yeah.
So the more problems that you got correct, the more money you'd get paid. And so this high-status person is sitting there thinking, I know what I'm doing. Why do you keep disagreeing with me? And we actually had a guy pound his fists on the table and yell an expletive that I won't repeat, but I think it's the same one you used when your microphone just cut out. Yeah, so you're right. There is some level of discomfort there when expectations are violated.
Do you think that's kind of what caused reactions to Obama? I always felt like part of the negative reaction that people had to Obama was seeing a black person not act subordinate, like to act like an authority figure. And I mean, if there is somebody who has like a strong idea of race status hierarchies, and they see somebody in their racial hierarchy who's not behaving with that inferior status that they'd want them to, if it angered them or distressed them, you could really, it helps make sense of some of the reactions that you see.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's becoming this central concept and this central measure that's coming up in many different projects. We use the same measure in the identity paper that you read. We're using it in that mugshot study that I mentioned. And what you're talking about sounds very similar to what we found in the mugshot study, where, again, people see a black man in a jumpsuit and they go, yeah, that makes sense. But then they see a white man in a jumpsuit and they're like, wait a minute, what's going on there? So the same kind of thing in what you're talking about. Of course, there's going to be individual differences here. Not everyone necessarily thinks that way. But yeah, I think for a certain segment of the population, perhaps that is what was going on. It's like, wait a minute, we're not used to seeing this. This is bizarre. What's going on here? So, there could be some sense of an expectancy violation there.
What I liked about that article is it resonated with my experience growing up Jewish in a place where there were no Jews. And it was like, I can understand how prejudice is higher in places where people don't have direct exposure to people of that group. And you develop these unrealistic ideas about how, different people of different races would act or how they are. And I could see how, if you had never met a black person in your life and, you got a bunch of unrealistic expectations of how black people should behave, then, yeah, it could be distressful. You're like jarred when you actually come up against a three-dimensional normal person and find that they don't act in, along the lines of your simple caricatures. It's interesting.
Yeah, I had an undergraduate student who did a totally fascinating project using the same measure, and she basically looked at, or had undergraduates look at pictures of females either in professional roles or in domestic roles. So in some of the pictures, the females were judges in a courtroom or doctors performing surgery. In other pictures, it was females washing the dishes and vacuuming. And what she found, even among, a fairly woke population of students at Kent State, was the feedback-related negativity, that event-related potential I was telling you about, that measure of expectancy violation, was bigger when participants looked at images of women in professional roles. So it's, how far have we come? I don't know. But, when you've got young undergraduate students looking at pictures of females in different roles and they see them in domestic roles and say, yeah, that makes sense. And then they see them in professional roles and, oh, wait a minute, what's going on there? So it's, it was such a fascinating study.
Yeah, it's like your sense of gender attitudes as filtered through like social desirability bias. It seems like young people would be very egalitarian and you're digging past their self-concept.
Yeah.
And finding that, they got regressive views too. This stuff is alive and well.
Yeah, and it's, does that necessarily translate into behavior? We didn't study that. But it is interesting that these, I guess for us, the idea was that, there's these cultural beliefs out there about who people are and what they should do. And we were clearly picking up on those cultural beliefs in this particular study. Again, whether that translates into some kind of discriminatory behavior is a different kind of question. But we did not expect to find what we found. It was among such a young population that's supposedly progressive.
Yeah. You know, this stuff is all so fascinating. And to me, like the benefits of building better theory are very, very obvious. But I would imagine that there are a lot of people in the discipline, I don't want to say who are hostile, but maybe are unenthused about sociobiology or biological driven explanations of social behavior. Like, obviously there's like a legacy of people using pseudoscience to justify racism, but that legacy might also cause people to pass on anything that smells of biology meets sociology. What is your sense of people's reactions to, you know, the intersection of biology and social science, and like, what, you know, how do you deal with it? How do you address people's reactions? Anybody who wants to jump in with that one can start.
I mean, it's a tough call. I mean, I would like to hear from Will too, because he's my senior, so I'm curious how his experiences have been. But in my experience, so I got my PhD in 2013. So I got my training for like 6 years, and then I did a postdoc and then entered as a professor. So I have been witnessing actually a decline in resistance from the sociology against biological and neuroscientific sciences. And I think it's primarily because neurosciences are advancing so rapidly. And it's a very popular field, and it's also very popular in popular media, that I think sociologists now understand that they can't really resist or object to it. Of course, there's still some resistance, there's still some hostility, but I think it has been changing. It's hard when I tackle with it. I tell them that, I mean, it's very important to give the exact science, give it accurately and acknowledge your limitations. It's very important to convey that some of these methods are also subjective. A lot of these methods, like brain imaging, is correlational. It's not causation. So it's very important to acknowledge and tell them that, look, this is just like any other scientific approach. We're trying to understand it. And a lot of sociologists would not disagree that we are evolved humans, like we are evolved beings. You know, a lot of sociologists are not going to deny human evolution. So there's a basic shared understanding that we're biological beings. You know, I mean, we all get sick and go to the hospital. There's no sense in denying that we have a biology. And I try to always give the message that we will miss out if we don't enter the dialogue. I mean, we need to be present so to like make the picture more complete, make it better. Otherwise, then the science will be biased. So that's the message I try to give, I think.
Well, what do you say? You've been in this a while, and I think it looks like you've sort of established a beachhead in the discipline in this type of work.
It's a lonely beachhead. I got the beach all to myself, and you know, sometimes Regan stops by, and then I go to her beach, and I mean, it's a very quiet beach.
What's the pushback though that you got in all this? Because I imagine it was tough to make it to this point.
Yeah, I think the example that comes to mind immediately was when I was going to teach a graduate seminar in neurosociology for the first time, and there was actually an effort to block the course.
Wow.
Really?
Yet we have no business teaching such courses in a sociology department. So that was interesting.
Wow.
So I had to defend this course, and I had some students take the course who specifically took the course to disagree with everything I said. And they ended up being some of the biggest fans of neurosociology when they left the course. So I've gotten kind of used to it, and I don't know if it's gotten better or worse over the years, but usually my strategy, you know, when someone starts talking about eugenics and social Darwinism and what is Professor Kalkhoff doing up in his lab with wires coming out of people's heads and everything, is, you know, I'll direct them to a few readings. You know, I'll say, before you judge me on what I'm doing, why don't you read some of the stuff that's being done, rather than being used to promote inequality or create inequality. You know, a lot of this research is being used to expose inequality and address inequality, and has applications to improving social inequalities or eradicating them. So that's the big part, is just go read something. And then the second thing I mentioned that seems to be the most persuasive is, if you want to critique what I do, you should probably learn something about it first, because no one's going to listen to you. You know, if you start criticizing somebody's neuroscience research and you know nothing about neuroscience, no one is going to listen to you at all. So if you want to be a watchdog, and I agree that we need watchdogs in science in general, you better know what you're talking about. And so I think sociologists could benefit from becoming more familiar with these methods and insights of neuroscience. So if they do have a critique of something, people will listen. But, you know, no one's going to listen to someone who has no education, training, or background in the methods or insights that they're criticizing.
At least we'd hope.
Yeah.
Maybe. No,
Well,
I'm saying that flippantly. No, I'm just making that as a joke. I have a question. So your field has a lot of strong interdisciplinary ties. And Kalina, you're doing the same thing on your end as a psychologist who works with sociologists. A lot of departments, a lot of people are more insular. And I was hoping you could just take a moment to speak about what's been rewarding for you about being so interdisciplinary. Because, I mean, the downsides are obvious, but we can all imagine the benefits, but how do you do it well? What type of attitude or posture should you assume when you're engaging in multi-interdisciplinary research, just to make it a payoff, make it work? Kalina, can you start?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I appreciate the question. And I think maybe it goes back to your earlier question about people's hesitance about neuroscience, you know, and where does that come from? It might come from feeling threatened or feeling that you want to reduce social phenomena to biological phenomena. But I think that my position that I communicate is that's not my goal. Like, my goal is not to reduce like the complexity and the beauty of social behavior to biological phenomena, but rather to discuss the connection between them. And if you see that the goal is to establish the connection between them, then that creates for a different dialogue. And I really, really believe that insular science is no longer a viable path forward. The questions that we have, the tools that we have at our fingertips require collaborations across disciplines, require people who have expertise in a particular area. I can't study the questions that I'm studying without the expertise of Regan, because I simply don't have the years of training, don't have the intuition and the insight, but we can work on them together. And I think doing it well, to me, I think it's important to pick people who are aligned with your values, who are curious and interested in the same goal, and also who have a generosity of spirit, you know, like who, you know, like what are they willing to teach me? What are they generous in what they're willing to teach me? And that will inspire me to be generous in return. And then together, I mean, just like the brain, right? Like, just like the brain isn't made up of individual parts, but of emergent properties. And I think that, like, to the extent that, you know, two people or more collaborative team can build something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So I think finding the right collaborators, that takes some trial and error, I think, but people who have a similar mindset, who share the same values, and who are generous in their time and their willingness to teach somebody without, you know, naive experience.
Well, how about you? How to make interdisciplinary research work its best? What is your advice, or what's your take?
Yeah, that was tough for me. I mean, I think it was really hard to convince people in other fields who had a neuroscience background to work with me. So I can imagine. Well, you know, because they immediately, and this happens a lot, and I mentioned this in the Social Compass piece, I think, is they saw me as the person who was going to say, yeah, I don't know anything about all this EEG stuff, but could you do this project for me? And I think, you know, so you really, for me, I had to engage in a lot of self-education. I had to learn a lot about social neuroscience, had to learn a lot about EEG before anyone would talk to me, because then if you sit down and they start throwing a bunch of jargon in your face and you understand what they're saying, I think they're much more willing to work with you, because now you're not you're not seen as somebody who's just, self-interested and is just going to use them to collect data for them. So, but I think once you establish those bridges, I totally agree with Kalina, and I know Regan agrees as well, that interdisciplinary is the wave of the future. And so I have found it, just very fruitful and productive and fun to engage with scholars in other disciplines to study behaviors that we have a mutual interest in. So I really think sociologists need to get more on board with that idea, that movement.
Yeah, I totally agree with both Bill and Kalina. I mean, that's why it's important for us to have this neurosociology as a subfield in sociology, so we can also train our students so they gain that common ground, common understanding that for interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary research, so they can enter the cross-dialogue. So it's not just expecting from the other side, so they can also give. So it's a mutually beneficial endeavor. And my experiences might have been different than Will, because when I entered the field, neurological training was available to me at Iowa. And I mean, it wasn't available, but I tried. So because I was able to get formal training that helped me enter the dialogue. So at first they were resistant. They were like, neuroscience. I did all my work in neurology clinic at Iowa. At first they were like, oh, so you want to do neuroscience? That was weird for them as a sociologist. But then I just was there like every day, and I just stick to it. And it, like, for several years, I just showed up, and then it changed their attitudes, and that just changed the dialogue. Then I was contributing, then I was doing the research, then I was entering the dialogue. But also, like Kalina said, finding the right partners is also very important, like having a dialogue. And I'm doing neurosociology and neurosciences because I'm fascinated by the brain. This research is fascinating to me. And when I'm doing research with Kalina, they're doing just such awesome stuff. They're measuring like cortical thickness. They're looking at like amygdala, and like they're just doing things that I never thought about. And I'm like, oh my God, this is so fascinating. I'm learning so much. So to be able to have this like different perspective and like in this intellectual stimulation, is very important to have a collaboration, an interdisciplinary collaboration. To me, it's this, I think, this internal joy. Like I need this joy to like move me forward in my research. That's because that's what I like to do. And I like to do it with the people that I like. So
right. It's also like, I find that very few people outside of the academy care about disciplines. You're usually interested in your topic expertise, and it's very easy to look for. I think what Will said, I that really resonated with me. In a topic, you'll look foolish if you don't know what other people are doing in your area. If you're studying racism and you don't know what psychologists have to say, or you don't know what economists have learned, or so, you're going to have partial knowledge, and you're sort of going to look intellectually provincial.
Yeah.
So that also is a nice lesson from you guys on that front. Final question, and this was actually an unexpected one, but it's one that I think it might be the most helpful. If a young person is interested in neuroscience and wants to go down that path, what's a must read? What's a book that must be read in your and present company excluded? We won't create those types of social pressures. We'll assume everybody here is definitely a must read. Beyond present company, though, who is must read? Start with Regan.
Yeah, so I built a neurosociology syllabus recently. So that's the question that was in my mind. So, and I found that it was a difficult question, actually, because I wanted equal representation from neurosciences and social sciences. That was difficult. And I also wanted to be able to represent different backgrounds, because like diverse backgrounds. And there's an effort in sociology to decolonize the syllabus, for example. Some of my dear colleagues work on that. And so I wanted to like consciously try to do that. I think, to be honest, for a sociology student, it's very important for them to be exposed to research from psychology and neurosciences. So I think that is the most important thing. That will be the most novel thing. And for the psychology or neuroscience students, reading So sociology is going to be very important, and I kind of challenging these barriers. And I'm not sure if I could give names. There's several names, but
Kalina, go for it. What's the must reads?
I think that the must reads for me, so every day we spend reading the empirical papers, and there are hundreds of them that are important and relevant. But if students want to be awed by neuroscience, I would recommend that they read a book, just to get just to be inspired and get and be awed. So I love Antonio Damasio's work on neuroscience and consciousness. Joseph Ledoux has written about the subjective experience of fear and anxiety. Ramachandran is another. And then I also try to think about representation in neuroscience. So Sarah Jane Blakemore has written about the developing adolescent brain. All of these books, I would say, are in my pile.
You can see she actually has a large pile behind her that she turned to. we wouldn't have time to enumerate all that behind you. Will, you got a book recommendation?
2 books. Student's Guide to Social Neuroscience by Jamie Ward. That book is awesome, and I assign it. It would be good for both undergraduates and graduate students and faculty interested in social neuroscience. So that one is a must read. So that's a very nice introduction to neuroscience methods and application to social questions. It goes through some of the different research areas in social neuroscience. Read that one first. The second one is to get an idea of what the neurosociological paradigm is David Frank's Neurosociology. That was one of the groundbreaking books in the field of neurosociology, and he really sort of lays it out. Here's the paradigm. Here's what we do. Here's why we're interested in it. So yeah, Neurosociology by David Franks and Jamie Ward's Student's Guide to Social Neuroscience. Between those two, you will probably start coming up with your own neurosociological questions, and then you start trying to work your way into a lab. Get a faculty member who's interested, and that's what happened to my student who did that EEG study on how people respond to women in either professional or domestic roles, images of them. She went down that path. It was like, read this book, and then that went to that, and then blah, blah. So those 2.
Will Kalkhoff from Kent State University, Kalina Michalska from the University of California, Riverside Psychology, and Regan Firat from the University of California, Riverside Sociology. Thank you to the 3 of you for talking to me today. You guys were awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
It's excellent.
You've been listening to the Annex of Sociology podcast. Thank you to Regan Firat, Kalina Michalska, and Will Kalkhoff for joining us today. We're on the web, theannexpodcast.com, on Twitter @Sociannex, and on Facebook, the Annex Sociology Podcast. The Annex Sociology Podcast is a production of the Queen's Podcast Lab. For more information, visit queenspodcastlab.org. Our producers are led by Lisette Moreno and Han Mei Cho. Music is by Lena Orsa. I'm Joe Cohen. Thanks for listening.